What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my re-review of Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire, which is a video I've been wanting to get around to for a while because of two reasons, really. One, the quality of my original video, which was done before this was my full-time job all the way back in early 2021. As this is one of those games I've been playing basically since it launched and got 100% of the achievements long before I started doing this full-time, and I'd like to think that somewhere in the meantime I've gotten slightly less terrible at making videos. However, that's not the only reason I wanted to take another look at this via a video. The other reason, of course, being, as I'm sure many people at this point are aware, at least my regular viewers anyway, last year in 2025 I completed the Ultimate, which is an extraordinarily difficult challenge associated with Deadfire that I was the 15th person to officially complete. That is because, again, it is extraordinarily difficult. And at the time of my original review, I had not done that, though I did talk a little bit about it there. And both of those reasons combined were a pretty good reason to make a thinly veiled excuse to play through the game again and talk a little bit about it. And so, let's do exactly that. Now, Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire is an interesting game in the sense that I've never really considered it like my be-all, end-all favorite of CRPGs. However, it's always kind of bounced around my top 5 to top 10 depending on my mood. The reason for that is, while I enjoy the game for what it is, I do think there are CRPGs that do more mechanically, that do more story-wise, and even gameplay-wise. Even though I do think there is more depth to Pillars as a series than people give it credit for, the main draw for me has always been the lore and the world, which is why I've made a bunch of videos about that in particular over the years, as it's by far the thing I was the most invested in. And yet, at the same time, coming from the original game, I think Pillars 2 does a lot of legwork in terms of making the system just flow a lot better, a lot of more refined elements to it, like just something as simple as being able to retarget a spell you've already started casting, even more control over your companion AI, and just a million little details that can go unnoticed if you don't play the game a ton. But as the fact that this video is coming out so much later than even just that original video might tell you, Pillars of Eternity 2 is a game that's a bit of a slow burn. It comes at you over time, the more you take time to think about it and absorb the story, even come back to it, play it again, come at things at a different angle, that kind of thing. It's just a game that has grown on me over the years, even though I've always liked it. And a lot of that is, again, just down to those details that you might not necessarily appreciate on a first playthrough, but that really start to shine on replays especially. And so, let's get on with the rest of the review and talk about all of it. Starting with, first, of course, the technical state. How's this game running? I can report that this game is basically in the exact state that it was in when I left it last, which is that the main issue you're likely to run into is some stuttering, especially the longer your save file runs on. I've heard it is much worse over on consoles. I've never played it on console, PC channel after all, and I have on occasion seen people mentioning other problems like the occasional game-breaking bug or something, but again, the only issue I've experienced personally, and by far the largest reported one, is the stutters that pop up, especially in, again, the later parts of the game. And so, let's move on to difficulty. If you've watched a lot of my videos over the years, you may well have heard me refer to Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire as both the easiest and hardest CRPG, depending on your mood. But when the game first released, it was just easy. Some of that is because, with relatively minimal knowledge, you can set up a decent AI in order to control your companions in the game's real-time with pause combat, and then even on the higher difficulties, you can actually let it autoplay for the most part, and then there wasn't a ton of challenge to be had. And so, taking in some of that feedback, over the time this game was receiving active patches, they added quite a bit of difficulty, both in the form of things like mega bosses and optional challenges known as Magran's Fires, which is where the Ultimate challenge actually springs from. That was added post-release, of course, because while you do have your standard difficulty options, basically story through the super hard mode, which is supposed to be Path of the Damned, but doesn't wind up being that difficult like I mentioned, you also have a bunch of extra options, like of course an Iron Man save file, or Expert mode, which turns off some of the helper features, etc. You also have the optional Magran's Fires that were added. Magran's Fires are special challenges that alter the way some of the game mechanics work in order to make for a more challenging experience overall. Now, I'm not going to go through every one of these. I have videos where I have done that, specifically talking about the Ultimate Challenge, because the Ultimate Challenge is in fact to play with all of these on at the same time, which makes the game not literally impossible, obviously, but extremely difficult. Just to throw a few out there so you kind of get a gist of what I'm talking about, some of the more impactful ones are the Aethys Challenge, which gives you a strict deadline to beat the game by as time is passing while you're playing. Barath Challenge, the God of Death's trial for you, if you will, is to make sure that combat does not end when it is started and you have to finish it, which combined with the Iron Man mode is obviously not great. However, that actually opens up some interesting combos that make that mode possible. And so while that might seem like a detriment at first, it actually is the ultimate thing that makes certain runs possible, because most of the time in combat, a lot of your buffs and stuff are per encounter. So when combat ends, that stuff just falls off, which means you can't carry it from fight to fight, and then you can use that new mechanic of combat not dropping via this challenge to actually do some stuff you cannot do otherwise. And then, of course, the most difficult one by far is Hylia's Challenge, which gives you the orphan from the first game that you could potentially take into the second game, Vela, and she follows you around, and if she dies, you lose. And she dies to basically everything. So again, there's just all those optional challenges to make it more difficult. However, there are some options to make replays more interesting even beyond that in the form of Barath's Blessings. Basically, every achievement for Deadfire is associated with a currency that you can then spend on bonuses to your next playthrough. This can be things like starting with the entire map revealed, extra starting cash, extra starting stats, and just all sorts of stuff to make replays a little bit of a smoother experience. I think that is fun overall, and it basically functions as the game's New Game Plus, if you want to think of it that way. Now, while not strictly speaking a difficulty option, another thing you have to pick right at the beginning of the game is actually turn-based or real-time with pause. Now, I'm going to be real with you, turn-based in Deadfire is not great. In fact, I would go so far as to say, for me, it's kind of unplayable. I really don't like it. Now, they did do an interesting thing, which is that they added turn-based mode to Pillars of Eternity 1 not all that long ago. Earlier this year, from the time of this recording, actually, where they addressed a lot of the criticism that turn-based mode received in Deadfire in that earlier game. So in a weird twist of fate, the original game actually has a better turn-based mode now than the second one does. However, another change there is while in the first game now you can toggle it in a playthrough, you can't do that here without using console commands in order to do it. And you don't want to do that because it comes with the potential of corrupting your save file. This is because of the ways that turn-based mode can change how certain things are calculated and some of that stuff works. And so you pick it at the start of a playthrough, and that's just what you're going to have to do for the rest of that playthrough unless you want to risk that save file corruption. Moving on a little bit though, next up let's talk about the world state. So Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire is a direct sequel from the original game. As far as the story is concerned, you play the same character from that original game, the Watcher of Cadnua. And so the game handles this in a couple of interesting ways. You can pick a preset history, which is basically a rough approximation of 6 different ways you could have played through the original game, that being making every mistake possible, doing everything pretty well, kind of being more judicious about it, etc. Now, the other option is, of course, to import your save file from the original game. If you've played through it and have an in-game save file, you can just use that as your history. However, there is a third option that is a little more obscure. I've noticed that a lot of people tend to miss it, which is just that you can make your own history. And what this means is that you can actually go to the main menu of Deadfire and go into the options there. And there will be an option to effectively create a Pillars 1 save file that gets added to the menu there as a history, meaning that you can just select it. So this means if you have specific choices and you know what they affect and you want to carry them forward into Deadfire, you can absolutely do so without playing through the first game. So in that way, you can just jump straight into the second one and the stuff you want to see if that's something you're trying to do. Though I certainly would recommend playing the first game at least once. Now, in case you're wondering about what gets carried forward, there's a lot of different stuff, so I would say that some of the more impactful things are basically which god you decided to side with, and if you actually followed through on that deal. So in the original game, in order to get to the end game, you need to make a deal with one of the gods. You have a few different options there, and you can also break that deal once you get to the actual endgame. Who you sided with and if you kept your end of the bargain is one of the more impactful choices you can make as it carries forward into the next game. But there's also all sorts of stuff that gets referenced, mostly in passing and dialogue here and there. And of course, whether or not you kept the companions alive. They can absolutely die in the original game and they could not be carried forward into the second one. And so if one of the companions that would normally be in the second game didn't survive your first game's save file, then they are just gone. So keep that in mind as you approach this game, I suppose. But then, one of my favorite parts of all of Pillars of Eternity 2 is its character creation. So let's talk a little bit about it. This is probably when you'll notice that they made some big changes from the system in the original game to the second one, and that is most immediately felt by the fact that you can multi-class in this one. This is also a decision you have to make as soon as you start with that character because it affects progression in a really integral way. For instance, if you multi-class, you will never get the last 2 tiers of abilities from either of the individual classes that your multi-class is made of. However, each individual class has also been given subclasses, and one of my favorite little well-known details is that the game will actually give you a unique class name based on every possible combination of multi-classing you could do, which is just a really fun little thing. Even beyond that stuff that's more immediately obvious, they also made a lot of changes to how leveling up works in general. For starters, you can preview the ability trees now, which is nice, but essentially every level, you're going to get either 1 or 2 abilities to put into those ability trees, and while some things like passives overlap, and multi-classing often forces you to choose between one tree or another per level, as you sometimes only get 1 point, and then other levels you'll get 2, or have to pick between, or be able to put 1 into both, etc. That's just a little bit different from how Pillars 1 handled things, but realistically, the fun here is, of course, in the builds you can make, and while yes, some of these classes are technically speaking a little better than others, based on potential build combos, balancing, all that usual stuff, I'll say this: if you're not playing on the highest difficulty with some of Magran's fires enabled, it's really not that big of a deal, and I would recommend you play the thing that sounds the most fun to you, with Cypher and Chanter really being the kind of things that are unique to the Pillars games in particular, the rest being more or less what you would expect them to be in other fantasy titles. Chanters work by building up their chants every so often in real time with pause or per turn and turn-based, and once they've chanted enough phrases which have their own individual effects, they can then spend those chanted phrases on abilities that they can cast in a sort of variation of a bard, but they're much more fun than that if you get into them. Cypher is all about mental and soul energy, which matches the watcher nature of your character very well, and we'll get to that in a moment. And they have a bunch of very unique abilities that play off of like positioning and targeting in ways that can be fun to mess around with. Now from here, rather than get too in-depth for a video like this, I instead want to give you a few of my favorites. Now some of the stuff I love the most isn't even like mechanically superior to a lot of other things. They're just really fun. Like one of my favorite multi-classes is Druid and Ranger, which is called a Beastmaster. And then with Druid, you can lean into their shape-shifting, and then of course have your Ranger pet from being a Ranger, and that's like a really fun combo that has a sort of natural synergy to it, especially for the Ranger abilities that require your pet to be in a certain proximity, which the shape-shifting leans into, and then even then you can still fall back on the Druid's like AoEs and control spells. For the ultimates, a really popular way to do that is Blood Mage and Priest of Skane. Now, I want to mention this in particular because this combo works specifically because of some of the challenges that are enabled, which is the other side of things. The min-maxing is there if you want it to be, and it is possible to build a character around certain mechanics you want to take advantage of. Blood Mage is able to basically spend their health in order to recoup class resources, which in combination with a buff called Brilliant, which helps you do the same thing. And the Priest of Skane's uncanny ability to get the spells you need at the exact levels you need them by default makes for an incredibly potent combo where combat doesn't end until you win. And with Wodika's challenge, recouping your class resources is much more difficult, as it becomes per rest as opposed to most of it being per encounter. But then, to give you yet another option, one of the way I approached this most recent playthrough, I played a Death Godlike. Godlikes are basically people who have been blessed with the appearance of the gods, which manifest as what is often referred to as a chime inside of them, but also gives them the outward appearance of the god they are blessed by, let's call it. So this Death Godlike has a connection to Berith, the god of death, cycles, doorways, etc. And so through the first game, you're going to inevitably meet that god as part of the main story, and while I wanted to play through as a cipher, I figured I would rope that into the details of the second game, where I decided that after meeting Berith, accepting her deal to get to the endgame of the original game, she also decided to grant you the power of a priest of Berith, as the priests in this game of course worship their associated gods, with this one having a slightly more complicated relationship with Berith. And so that was a fun sort of roleplay centered multi-class that is also pretty fun to play, because priest is a great class to multi-class other stuff with, because it has a ton of support and utility abilities that pair well with just about anything, but there's ways to add flavor and roleplay to all of that stuff, and hopefully those examples kind of gave you an idea of what's possible, because from there I do want to go ahead and move on and talk a little bit about the story. The story is one of the things in Deadfire that gets the most flack, and that is mainly because it is very, very short. In fact, in total, it's technically only like 4 quests, and while you're unlikely to do it on a first playthrough, you can easily burn through it in a few hours. But let's talk a little bit about it. So, in this game, you play as the Watcher of Cadnua no matter what character you choose to create. The Watcher of Cadnua is called such because they are a Watcher, which is someone who can see into the beyond and talk to and interact with the souls of the dead, opening up possibilities to them that are simply not something every random person can do. Watchers are relatively rare, and they tend to go crazy from what they've seen, which is a big subject of the original game. Now, the Cadnua part is because Cadnua is your stronghold in the original game, which gets unceremoniously destroyed by a giant Audra statue, Audra being the conduit through which souls pass into the beyond from the mortal realm. Now, this statue, as it turns out, happens to be inhabited by the god Aethys, long thought dead, after having been destroyed once he manifested in a physical form via Saint Widewin in events that preceded even the first game. So him not only suddenly coming back, but then animating this Audra statue and marching off to the distance, while also killing you by destroying your stronghold in the process, gives you a pretty strong reason to want to track the guy down, which is exactly what the goddess Berith orders you to do, which is how you become the Herald of Berith as far as this game is concerned. And that's basically the main plot. You chase Aethys around the Deadfire archipelago that he is marching through. At first, after you are attacked right as the game starts and you come back to life after being sent back by Berith, you track him down at the Engwithan dig site nearby and get your ship up and running again before you can start sailing the Deadfire. From there, you go meet the major players in the main city Neketaka. You then go to Hasango and do the same thing, talk to Aethys. Then you go to a place called Ashen Maw and talk to Aethys again. And then you find a way through a big storm to the endgame of Ukaizo. And that is the entirety of the main story. And while, in theory, the last leg of it, getting past Andra's mortar, is supposed to see you interacting with one of the factions, which is technically side content, to get away past that giant storm, that's actually really easy to do in a couple of different ways and doesn't take long at all. And so what you have is a story that is very short, with yet gigantic implications for the lore of the world, which I'm going to get into. So, like I said, I love the lore of this world, and one of the things that really roped me in about it was the way reincarnation and cycles work here. While I have not been light with spoilers thus far, I'm about to get into super heavy spoilers here. You see, the big reveal of the original game was basically that the gods were manufactured. They are real in the sense that they are present, you can talk to them, they are very powerful, and they are unquestionably gods. However, they are not natural. They were made by a civilization known as the Engwithans. They did this as a result of getting into animancy, which is the study of souls in this world, and they studied it to a point where they eventually started seeking out their own creators. That age-old question of how did we get here? And unfortunately for the Engwithans, what they found was nothing. If there was a creator or a deity, it seemingly had long since left, and they were left alone in the universe and decided then that they would become the gods. And through a whole lot of nonsense at Ukaizo, the ancient ancestral homeland of the Huana civilization, which are the main controllers of the Deadfire archipelago even to the day of this game, is where they did that. The machinery that turned the Engwithans into these deities is housed at Ukaizo. It's also where the machinery that took control of a natural process known as the wheel or reincarnation occurred. So a few big lore topics there right away. The wheel was a natural process by which souls were recycled more or less through the reincarnation process. This wasn't perfect and was prone to errors and could cause things like hollowborn, which are people born without souls, and a number of other soul maladies that are expressed throughout the games, where that process could go wrong. And while they still happen, even in the time of the gods, it was apparently much worse before they took power. Combine that with a bunch of civilizations all trying to worship deities they had made up and doing terrible, atrocious things in their name, the Inguithans basically wanted to use their ascension to godhood as a way to force all of the civilizations in the world of Eora to march forward, become stronger and better themselves, and of course, do so under their own banners. However, this leads to a few other things. One, the gods themselves aren't individual people. Each individual deity is actually made up of who knows how many thousands of Inguithans who were each selected for kind of their rough personality traits, because the deities that they wound up making took the place of legends and myths of deities that kind of were already around in their time. So they basically just took on the mantle of some things people around had already believed in, and chose to make it real while squashing the rumors of things that did not fit into their pantheon. Now, they accomplished that by, again, taking control of the wheel, this natural process of reincarnation, and forcing it into an unnatural but more efficient process, which cut down on the number of soul maladies and gave it direction, which is what allowed them to ascend to godhood like this. But this came with a bit of a catch. You see, all these untold thousands of years later, that machinery has controlled that process for so long that that process can no longer function without that machinery. Meaning that if someone were to, say, destroy it, the process would be broken, which is a problem because the gods feed off of the energy from the reincarnation cycle. As souls enter the beyond and get reincarnated, it produces the energy that the gods need to survive, and of course then provides souls for future generations of the mortals that inhabit the world of Eora, in a sort of mutually beneficial situation. The thing is, Aethys, as the god of rebirth, light, dawn, etc., kind of hates this, and he wants to do something about it, which is what he was trying to do when he was killed in the version of him that was Saint Widewin, and again, those events that preceded the first game. And the second time around, he decides to take a more direct approach of taking this giant Audra statue to march to Ukaizo, where this machinery is, and destroy it to stop the process of reincarnation. And that happens no matter what you do. You cannot stop it, but you can have some effects on the outcomes, which then leads to the game's various endings based on both how you got there and how you influenced Aethys along the way. But the reincarnation cycle getting broken is the ending. That happens no matter what. And you're left with this big cliffhanger then that while a lot of souls are already in the process of being reincarnated, and that will continue, there's basically a generation or two before that process stops completely, at which point the deities will die because they won't have any sustenance via the energy coming through the wheel, and every single person born after that will be born without a soul, which basically means hollowborn, and so a solution will have to be found. And you may be asking, why would the god of light and rebirth choose to do that? And the simple answer is that he was tired of living that lie. He wants mortals and the gods themselves to either find a way forward together or to die together, as opposed to being trapped in this endless cycle of them trying to manufacture some idealized society that the deities themselves can't even readily agree upon. Now, as fun as that is, that's really only scratching the surface of the lore. There's a lot of really cool stuff there. There is the added lore of Avowed, which came out, that has huge implications, because even more spoilers for Avowed here. A crux of Avowed is that a natural-born god is discovered, Sapidal. It turns out that while there were apparently no deities around when the Inguithans sought them out, it turns out that it wasn't impossible or anything, because in Avowed, we find one that was born that way, only for the Pantheon to immediately attack it, which then leads to the events of Avowed itself. And that is to say nothing of Yezua. So Yezua is a thing that is kind of briefly mentioned in a couple of the games, but a lot of it comes from Deadfire in particular, because a sidekick you can get, Reke, is from there. It's a continent on the other side of the world, blocked by Andra's mortar. Andra's Mortar is the giant storm that protects Kaizo from discovery prior to this game. It also made travel to the other side of the world seemingly impossible, which is where Yezua was, and Yezua is a world where they worshipped a single deity that seems to be probably another natural-born god situation, but that's just speculation and we don't really know. Because, again, it's just kind of a thing that pops up. So, in theory, if they were to ever make a Pillars 3, which seems exceedingly unlikely, all things considered at this point, they have a lot of stuff to work with, and I would love to see a conclusion to it, because if you couldn't tell by this very long rambling, I'm pretty invested in the story, and I would love to see what comes of that conflict and how a problem like that gets solved, and again, how all that stuff gets approached. And it's incredibly interesting to me, at the very least, which is one of the reasons I've loved this game so much and made all those lore videos about it. But let's go ahead and move on a little bit to progression. So progression is interesting because, again, like I mentioned, they did change a little bit of it from 1 to 2, introducing things like power levels, making gear and itemization much more interesting. There's your ship that you'll be using to sail around, the way crafting and resting bonuses work, and just all these other modifiers and things that you could potentially turn on via Magran's Fires, which can affect progression. So all of that is probably worth a quick mention. The simplest being levels, of course, though. As you kill things, complete quests, etc., you will be leveling up. As you level up, you will get access to higher tiers of abilities up until the max level of level 20. Now the thing is, every tier of ability that you go up, which is roughly every couple of levels, you also increase your power level. As your power level goes up, all of your abilities increase in strength. This is how they keep lower tier abilities relevant throughout the entire game, and that applies to every single class. You can also, in combat, even affect this a little bit farther by using the new Empower ability. Empowering basically allows you to cast a spell or ability at a higher power level than it would normally have, and there's a couple other ways to affect that as well, but it's definitely something to keep in mind. Now, where I think progression in Deadfire really shines is actually itemization. The gear that you'll be picking up and using. And this is because, by default, any character can basically use any type of equipment. Now, when it comes to weapons, you can become proficient in them. You gain proficiencies every, I think it's like 4 or so levels as your character levels up, but all that really does is allow you to use the special ability associated with that weapon, which isn't always useful and not even really necessary all the time. Now, the catch there is the heavier stuff you wear, in particular your armor, increases your recovery time, which means you act slower in real time with pause, and then the rest of it is just items that have various effects that you can make use of. And so I figured I would give you a couple of examples of my favorites. My favorite item in the entirety of Deadfire isn't even that good, but it's a arquebus called the Red Hand. You get this in the capital of Nekataka, specifically in the black market, known as Delver's Row. This is basically just a two-handed gun that is really cool to me because of an enchantment. You can enchant unique weapons and armor with extra abilities and increase their overall usefulness. This enchanting mechanic can be used to give the Red Hand an ability called Double Tap. Double Tap is an enchantment that means if you hit any vessel-type enemy twice in a row with the Red Hand, it immediately dies. And that can be used on bosses, and basically just anything you can get 2 consecutive hits on. As the name would imply, it also lets you shoot twice per attack. Combine that with a ranger who actually gets an ability to also shoot twice as well, and you're off to the races. But there are straight up bosses you can instantly, not literally one shot, but I suppose 2 shot with this rifle. And it's just one example of the way itemization is approached here, where you can use it to do some really fun stuff in specific situations, because that specific item can trivialize a couple of really difficult fights against that one specific enemy type. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. In order to complete the ultimate, as at least the way I did it, you make use of a buff called Brilliant. Brilliant is a rare, in the sense that there's not a lot of things that give it to you, buff that basically allows you to restore class resources. There is a cloak that allows you to put Brilliant on yourself that you can find in Bakarna's Observatory by basically hitting yourself. And as long as you give yourself a way to survive that, like say the Priest spell, Barring Death's Door, which makes you unkillable for a set time, and then combining that with another Priest spell called Salvation of Time, which increases the length of the buffs that are on you right now, like say Barring Death's Door, and the Brilliant Inspiration, or buff, that allows you to, again, restore class resources, meaning you can continually cast the spells, allowing you to make that cycle. You can set up a situation where your character in combat is literally unkillable thanks to these spells, and unless the enemy has a way of removing them, you cannot die, which is one of the ways, thanks to Bareth's challenge as part of the ultimate, not dropping combat, you can get through some of the encounters that would otherwise not be possible. But to not spend too long on it, basically when it comes to itemization and how you can approach combat, there's actually so much depth there if you go and look for it, and you can just find all these little ways to interact with those systems in really unique ways that are just so much fun. And again, that is one of the parts of this game that I've just come to appreciate more and more over the years. And that's not even all of it. Another bit of progression is pets. Only you can equip a pet by default, but one of the Bareth's Blessings actually lets you give it to a deer as well. And pets will give you a party-wide effect, and you can find tons of pets throughout the game, and there was an update that added this thing called the Critter Cleaver, I think it is, that lets you make custom pets by sacrificing the pets you have found to it to get the exact combination of a pet you want following you around and the effect you actually want it to give you. And then there is your ship, of course. We are sailing around the Deadfire after all, and you do actually have to do that via a ship. Now, I will say you do technically need to keep your ship stocked with food and water, but that is trivially easy if you are not using the Magrin's fire that makes your food and stuff rot. That is actually, I think, one of the small balancing things that the base game could have changed. It's actually so easy to do that in the base game that I think it kind of removes the point of it being there at all, because there's just no friction at all. You'll find more than enough food, more than likely, to keep everyone fed and made sure they're drinking as well as you move your ship along. But in Nekataka, you will find a shipyard, the docks there, where you can buy new ships to upgrade to, and then you can actually upgrade those ships via parts and things, as well as hire sailors and stuff to man it, which is important for ship combat, but we'll talk about that here in the next section. Upgrading and maintaining a ship is a big part of it, and if you want to get through Andra's Mortar on your own, one of the two ways you can do that is by upgrading your ship to the best hull and sails. There are a couple of unique ships as well that you'll only get through certain quests as part of the story, sort of. Then there is crafting and resting. You can put to use all of the junk you are picking up, which you can pick up everything, there's no weight limit or anything, to some use by crafting scrolls, potions, food, meals, etc. And when you rest, you can use those meals to give you buffs, and do not underestimate how useful that is. Some of those buffs are crazy. But that's the bulk of what you're looking at progression-wise, which brings me then to the gameplay and world section. So, Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire uses a world map system where, when you are not in a given location, you'll be traveling around the world via land or sea. At sea, you'll of course be using your given ship in order to sail around. You can have random encounters and stuff that deal with that as well, that take the place of text events. While you are typically traveling on land, though a couple places at sea as well, you will find locations, and these are, typically speaking, either a text event or a physical place you can actually explore, which is most of like the cities and hub areas, of course. The text events are relatively basic. Sometimes they'll lead to fights, or you can use your non-combat skills as a way around the given situation and pick up loot and stuff from those also. Now, the first part of the game structurally sees you trapped on an island trying to get your ship back up and running after you get attacked by pirates at the beginning of the story. This area, called Port Mage, is really the only part of the story that you are hemmed in. Because once you get that done and you get your ship, you can basically go wherever you want as long as you have the level to do so. Now, there is scaling if you want there to be in the game's options. You can scale just the main story up. You can scale or scale down everything to your character's level to try to make it more challenging. But basically, once you leave Port Mage, technically speaking, you can go wherever you want. And that actually does make things a little more interesting than people give it credit for, because, as you may remember, I said the main story was short, and it is. However, the game of Deadfire is like 90% side content. You can technically beat the game while seeing very little of what the game actually has to offer, and exploration plays a really big role in that. One of my favorite mechanics there is that some of the islands that you will find are technically unexplored, and you can go there and see what's what. There's usually like a dungeon or place to explore, a sort of like main event, if you will, and once you get that done and exit, you'll actually be able to name that island. And there's a bunch of those. There's quests surrounding it to sort of send you you to them, and I really, really love that. And then there's, of course, Nekataka, the main city, which is made up of several different hub areas you can travel between. Each individual port has port services you can make use of, basically a supply store if you just want to stop in and buy supplies before you move on to where you're actually going, that kind of thing. And there's a lot of just like wonderful little details there. In fact, to give you one, your crew, if their morale is high, if you're not feeding and watering them basically, they will eventually drop morale and potentially mutiny. But if their morale is high, they will potentially sing sea shanties. And the sea shanties actually have varying voices and stuff that will sing them based on the makeup of your crew. And again, just wonderful little bits of detail. However, I want to talk about naval battles, and then I want to talk about some of the bigger stuff political-wise, as far as the game is concerned anyway. Now, on the naval battles, they changed this after the game released. When the game initially released, when you came across another ship or you got attacked by another ship, you could enter into a naval battle, or a ship combat, basically. This was initially done purely through a text event. The text event wasn't a lot of fun, and in my opinion, it still isn't. And so what people would do, and myself included, was basically get the fastest ship you could, which is the Voyager, fully upgrade it, and then when you enter the naval combat text battle, you just full speed ahead as fast as you can to the other ship, which would be before they got a chance to attack, and you would board, because boarding them brings you to an actual combat situation that is much easier to win, and frankly, a whole lot faster to win. Post-launch, when everyone was doing this, because it was just the easier thing to do, they did change this to where now, when you encounter another ship this way, you get the pop-up that you're seeing on screen, where you have the choice to either engage in that text event, immediately board them, or try to surrender or flee. Surrendering sees you taking a morale hit and losing supplies, but, not necessarily dying to a battle you cannot win, and then fleeing gives you a chance of avoiding the encounter entirely. And so that in particular is a little easier these days. But from here, I want to talk about the factions. One of the things I find really, really interesting about Deadfire is the way the colonialism and the political situation around the archipelago is set up. Because while there are independent routes through the game, it's actually kind of split up between 4 different factions otherwise. The natives, the Huana, the 2 factions trying to set up outposts here, Rawatai, as well as the Valian Trading Company. And then, of course, your pirate faction, the Principe. Now, this is set up in such a way that a lot of these characters are at odds with each other, of course, and they're all trying to politically maneuver and gain leverage over the others. And when you dig into that and do all of the quests, it's really, really interesting. And you can work for all of them up until their very last bit of questing, right before the end of the game, where you do have to commit to one of them fully. But you may or may not lose companions based on what you choose to do there. Who's following you. You get companions from the factions. They'll leave you if you do this, that, or the other. So you may want to go the independent route just because of that, but more on that in a moment. Let's start with the Huana. The Huana are the natives, a tribal society still using a caste system that, thanks to their expansion into a city like Nekataka, is fraying at the seams and no longer working because their lowest caste, the Roparu, feed off the scraps of others, which has turned into kind of a literal rotting pile of food in the slums known as the Gullet. So the Huana are struggling with the growth they've seen, and they're also struggling against these factions that have come in to basically stake their claim to the Deadfire for one reason or another. But while the Huana have seemingly grown a little more tolerant of people coming to the Deadfire, they have a bit of an ace up their sleeve in terms of defense, and that is actually the Water Shapers, because while Rawatai has their big cannons and well-made ships and honestly a bit higher tech than everyone else, it's very difficult to fight an enemy that can literally take the water out from under your ship and just sink it entirely, causing waves, etc. Because Water Shapers are basically Avatar the Last Airbender in the sense that they can control and move water, or shape it, if you will, as they please. This is shown via the Water Shapers Guild. However, if you dig a little deeper, you learn why the Huana have started to allow outsiders in. It's because their power is waning. You see, the Huana were charged anciently with a covenant to the goddess of the oceans, Ngati as she is called here, or Andra as she is known elsewhere. But as the Huana started to cede ground to outsiders for one reason or another, that covenant weakens, making their water shaping weaker. But it was, of course, a slow battle. There was, however, a water shaper named Pariki who got some help from a dragon that she later betrayed and then trapped that dragon, binding the water shaping to draw on the dragon's power as their power from Andra waned. And this has caused the slow decline of the water shapers, along with the outsiders coming further into the Deadfire, to just weaken over time. And so the water shapers are really kind of a pale imitation of what they used to be. And so the Huana are trapped in this vicious cycle of needing the water shapers to defend themselves, but also knowing that the water shapers are losing their power and that's not a fight they can win forever. And so they're basically trying to play diplomat and set themselves up for success that way in an effort to continue to control their own territory, losing the battle by attrition, basically. Then you have the Rawatai. The Rawatai's interest in the Deadfire is actually to do with Andra's mortar. Rawatai is an area that is racked by constant storms, much like the exact storms of Andra's mortar, in fact. And so Rawatai wants to come here, study that, and see if there's a way to stop it, basically, so they can actually prosper. They're also, thanks to the harsh way they have been living, all about their military might, cooperation, and triumph in the face of adversity. This doesn't make them particularly nice people, however. One of their representatives at Sura will literally take into account your character's disposition, so as you talk to people, you gain a reputation, more or less, or a disposition based on your responses. This can be things like shady or stoic, cruel, that kind of thing, and Atsura will frame his responses and how he tries to get you to do things based on your character's disposition. So he has a bunch of varying dialogue based on how he thinks he needs to talk to you in order to get you to do the thing you want to do, which I thought was an interesting approach to a character like that, because he's very clearly not somebody who's got the best of intentions, especially when the assassinations come to light. But they are, whether you like it or not, a lot more stable than the others. For sure, they're trying to build and focusing on tech and doing a lot more technological advancements than a lot of the others are, and that's why they rely on the strength of their cannons, after all. Then you've got the Valian Trading Company, basically the people using animancy to try to further their own ends. Animancy being the science that was much discussed in the original game that has only advanced since then, the study of souls, basically. And they use this to invent tech to solve their problems, and in order to do that, they need Luminous Adra. Luminous Adra is unique to the Deadfire, a very powerful form of, again, the conduits through which souls pass to the beyond. And so their interest in the Deadfire is trying to harvest as much of that Adra to advance their animancy as possible, and this leads to exciting new discoveries. And then last but not least, there are pirates, and I feel like I probably shouldn't need to explain their motivation, but in case it wasn't obvious, they're obviously after that booty. And some treasure, from what I understand. Now, the Principi are actually a little more interesting than just being pirates as well, because they are oftentimes people's last resort. They can certainly get up to shady things. They are also not at one with themselves. They are divided between the New Bloods and the Old Bloods, who have very different ways of looking at things. But in some ways you could kind of consider them a necessary evil, because they are one of the only people willing to do something about the starving Roparu from the Huana's lowest caste, that is to say, help them. But obviously they're not exactly doing it out of the kindness of their hearts either, but depending on which faction you're dealing with, they are more than happy to undercut all sorts of different laws, as you would expect from pirates. Some of them are slavers, some of them are anti-slavery, they're kind of all over the place, but trusting any of them completely would be a questionable decision. And for me at least, I really love how each of those factions is represented in a way that feels plausible, let's say. Like, each of these factions and their motivations seems realistic. They all have different qualities to them. Some of them are doing some good things. Usually that's coupled with him also doing some terrible thing, and so if you're looking for like a moral high ground here, there really isn't one. It's just kind of shades of gray and which questionable thing you're okay with them doing, or none of them, because you can go the independent route if you want. But that back and forth is really compelling, and each of them has their own quest line, and many of them are associated with companions. So before we start talking combat, let's talk a little bit about companions. Companions are, for the most part, representatives of a faction. A couple of them are returning from the original game, Adir and Aloth, as well as Palagina, and then we also get some new ones as well via Tekehu. Now, truth be told, companions are a little hit or miss for me. I think actually this might be the last game Obsidian did with romance. So there is romance in here if you want it, that you can't romance everybody. But I guess you could call it a problem is that a lot of these companions outside of what are clearly meant to be the main ones don't get a lot of interactions. So much so that they, post-launch, actually had to add a recommended companion by quest you could undertake. So you could try to get the most out of them. But if you fail to do that, there are some of these companions who might barely say anything along your journey. And that's complicated a little farther by the fact that there's your actual companions and then there are sidekicks. Sidekicks are characters that are kind of in between a hired mercenary and a full-blown companion, and they really only have interactions in a couple of quests. The thing is, companions don't feel that much better than side quests in that regard, depending on, what quest you're doing with them in your party. But for the most part, try to do the faction quest with that faction companion, and you'll be mostly better off. Now, Aloth and Adir return from the first game. They're mostly the same. Aloth is dealing with the fallout of the Leaden Key from the first game. Adir is trying to reconcile his sort of belief in Aethys with what is happening here, and that's actually kind of more interesting than might initially sound. He has a more grounded feel to him. You've got Maya Rua, the sister of Kana Rua from the first game. She is a representative of Rauatai and gets up to some shady stuff in the name of progress for Rauatai, and she has to struggle with the realities of doing what is needed to impose order here, at least as far as Rauatai sees it, which is difficult for her. Pallegina makes her return. Pallegina is in fact a member of the Valian Trading Company. Pallegina is most interesting for reasons that have nothing to do with the VTC, as it were, because she is also a godlike, or something of a former godlike in some ways, because at an early age she had her chime sort of severed, the thing that makes a person a godlike, and so as a result she is not a full godlike the way you would think of the rest of them, which is why she looks the way she does. And she has a side quest that kind of like leans into the nature of godlikes and stuff that is super interesting. So there's that, and then there is Seraphin. Seraphin represents the Principe. He is an Orlan cipher usually, and he's alright. To be honest with you, he's a little run-of-the-mill for me. His character is very, I would say, on the nose in terms of where they go with his story and stuff. It's actually really easy to miss his companion quest, because even in the Principe quest lines, I feel like he doesn't have that much to say, so he's always felt a little underwhelming to me. One of the better ones, however, is Tikehu, the Hawana representative. He is a water shaper, and more importantly, he is a marine godlike. That is important lore-wise because it confirms that gods can in fact make multiple types of godlike, and Tikehu is special in that regard. There's only one of him. There are a lot of moon godlike, and they are also associated with the goddess Andra, but Andra made Tikehu very, very specifically. She considers him like her son, and it's a very different situation, and that's important for another lore reason, which I may or may not bother to explain. I'll see how I feel. But he's lived a cushy life. The Hawana see him as this incredibly good omen, and they've done basically everything they can to make his life very easy, and as such, he's a bit of an artist and sees water shaping as art, which is very different from how other water shapers see it, and where they struggle, he's a natural. He's a fun one to have around. His main story is about him trying to reconcile who he is with who the Hawana are and how to move forward, and of course Andra's role in all that and how she sees him and wants him to grow. Interesting guy overall. But then, last but not least, for the actual companions, we have Jodi. Jodi is a priestess of Gon, which is one of the aspects of Aethys. She sees gathering up lost souls and guiding them to their rebirth, if you will, as her role in her priesthood. How she does that, how she feels about it, how she goes about it, and whether or not it drives her absolutely bananas is the nature of her particular story, which is pretty interesting overall. As someone who's tied really closely to Aethys, she gets a ton of interactions, as you would expect, and as a priest, she's super useful because of her support ability, so I usually keep her around for that. Everyone else is a sidekick. Now, what's curious about sidekicks is pre-DLC, they did not have hardly any interactions. They had a couple of things here and there, but the DLCs actually added a bunch of interactions for these sidekicks, which actually makes them feel a little more impactful. Like Vatnir, for instance, is a sidekick that was added by Beast of Winter, and he is like one of the main focuses of that DLC, so he gets a ton of interactions there. And while that's a late game thing, and so he doesn't get a lot of play elsewhere, he's neat in that regard, and combined with him being a godlike of Rimmergrand, which he's the only one we've ever seen in the game, and that's pretty neat. There's also Reke, which I've already mentioned. He gives you all that lore on Yezua. Constantine, a dwarf you can pick up in Nekataka, gets a bunch of interactions in the Seeker Slayer Survivor DLC. Fascina and Aloth actually both get a bunch of interactions in the Forbidden Sanctum DLC. And Yidwin, the Cypher you can also pick up in Nekataka, gets some interactions and some unique ones even in Beast of Winter, which open up some, let's say, less than nice options for you. So they have a lot of companions with varying levels of, I would say, interactivity with the player. Some of them feel a little underwhelming as a result of that, but there are some pretty good interactions there if you go out of your way to make sure you're cycling through companions and you have the right one at the right time, which can be a little much. From there, though, I finally want to move on a bit to combat. So let's talk about combat. You've almost certainly seen some of it playing in the background here up to this point. As mentioned, combat is either a turn-based or real-time with pause-based affair. I vastly prefer real-time with pause. I don't feel like turn-based is implemented super well in Deadfire, but if you're playing on normal, you'll probably be fine, but real-time with pause is my go-to here. One of the main things you need to know straight away are then the AI setups. So something you can do that we've actually seen in previous games like Final Fantasy XII or Dragon Age Origins is you have this system of conditionals that you can set up in order to customize a character's AI, and that is how they will act when you are not controlling them, provided you have it turned on. You can get super granular with this, so much so that you can basically set up characters to automate themselves entirely. I've been playing this game enough over the years that I actually have a custom AI setup for basically every character that you can play, and so while occasionally I might give them directions, for the most part they're free to kind of do their thing, which then lets me focus a little more on what my main character is doing, but you can also do the same thing for your main character if you want. However, you also don't have to do that. Like, you can get in there and control characters yourself if you want. Like, for instance, when you're playing solo. Like, for my ultimate run, I only really automated like one thing, and that's because I was actively involved in controlling and making sure everything happened as I needed it to, and you're only controlling one character there, so it makes sense to do that. The only thing you really need to automate in that situation was the casts on Salvation of Time so you don't accidentally die. Now, I've already mentioned a couple of these things, but some improvements that they've made on the combat system from the original game are things like the ability to retarget a spell or the empower abilities. So in the original, if you cast a spell and like people moved or whatever and you wanted to retarget it, you couldn't do that, but here you can. You can just click on the retargeting button and move the spell where you actually want it to go based on where things have moved to or how things have played out, etc., which is a nice little thing. Empower allows you to cast a spell or ability at a higher power level than you normally would be able to. When you hopefully need that little bit of extra oomph, then you can do that so many times per rest. You don't even need to use Empower that often, but there are situations where it is very useful, and there are some items from the DLC in particular that lean into that. So there's certainly that. But let's talk a little bit about the basics from there. So real-time with pause mode is in large part determined by things like your recovery time. Based on how heavy your character is and some of your stats and your attributes and how you've distributed them, you have a base recovery time. So recovery time is simply how long you have to wait in between actions to take another action. Ideally, the lower the better. But if you have something like a low dexterity, or you have heavy armor on, or you're using a slower weapon like a two-hander, it can take a little while in between attacks and whatnot, and you obviously want to minimize that. There are class features that can help with this, like fighters can mitigate some of the recovery time from heavier armor as an example, and it's just something you need to keep in mind, because ideally you want to take as many actions as possible so the enemy can't do as much and you can interrupt what they are doing. Now, in order to hit the enemy, it's basically accuracy versus one of their 4 defenses. Most everything you do is going to target one of a character's 4 defenses, things like fortitude or will, and almost everything you do has a baseline accuracy based on your stats as well, and obviously you just want to be more accurate than their defense is. There are also other aspects to this, like penetration and armor rating and some finer details that are mostly pretty self-explanatory, like the higher armor, the less damage you're going to take from physical attacks, stuff like that. The power level thing that I mentioned. But for the most part, it's a relatively straightforward system that I don't feel like is super difficult to get your head around. Really, most of the fun for combat from me comes with itemization and the things you can do. As I've also already mentioned, there's stuff like the Red Hand, which lets you just two-shot various enemies, even bosses included, which is really fun. There's the stuff you can do with Barring Death's Door and Salvation of Time. There's a bug with an item called, I think it's Strand of Favor, which lets you like indefinitely stack like durations of effects and things, which is also kind of fun. And so while combat can be this really simple thing that you just get good equipment and automate it with, there's also this deeper layer if you choose to go looking for it, especially on higher difficulties, where you find like all these like little interactions and things you might not necessarily think about and how they can benefit you. But then of course there's how that functions normally, and then there's how that functions during, like, say, Barath's combat challenge, where combat doesn't end until those enemies die. Under normal circumstances, however, combat ends when you get far enough away from an enemy, and early game on higher difficulties, this is actually really useful because something you can do is just kite enemies away from where they start, and some of them usually won't make it, and so you can kind of separate groups of enemies to make them a little more manageable, just as a matter of like slightly more divide and conquer, if you will. If you don't like the companions or the classes or abilities they have on offer, you can go either respec them or just hire mercenaries that you can make on your own and add them to your party, even though they won't necessarily have any interactions. You can also use items from your pockets to do things like summon in creatures or set traps, which leans into stealth a little more. So outside of all of that, you also have active and passive skills where you can do all sorts of stuff with them, really, but like something you can do, for example, is set traps for enemies to walk into and potentially damage them that way. Stealth is present. I don't like combat stealth personally, but non-combat stealth is super easy to take advantage of because of the way line of sight works. Stealing things via stealth is extraordinarily easy, probably a little too easy to be honest. But if you want to, like, say, pickpocket characters, you're going to want a high stealth and sleight of hand, and you can do all of that. And those are things you can do to initiate combat from stealth. And you can even use stealth and an item called spark crackers to redirect enemies and cause them to investigate things, which is another way you can approach things via, like, divide and conquer strategies, if you will. And so, strangely enough, I guess the main point I want to get across in the combat section is really just that I think Deadfire is a rare game that actually embodies the saying of easy to learn, hard to master. There is nothing particularly complicated about Deadfire's combat, but there is so much depth there if you go looking for it. And as you probably know if you watch a lot of my CRPG videos, I love some mechanical depth. And short of just like going class by class and talking about individual things or effects, I think that's probably the best broad overview I could give you without getting a little too bogged down in the details. So next up, we're going to talk DLC. Deadfire ultimately got 3 DLC. One I don't like very much, and 2 that I think are very cool. So the one I don't like is Seeker Slayer Survivor. This is a basically arena DLC where you can take on various combat challenges via an island called Kazuwari and its arena, the Crucible. The story here is alright, but the main thing here is just combat challenges in the form of various arena fights. They're okay. Ironically, I think they're easier to do in the Ultimate than they are to fight normally, which is kind of funny, but I don't know, this one just never really spoke to me. I will say next, Beast of Winter is my favorite. I love this. I think Rimmergand is just like a really cool god and character, and this DLC focuses on him a lot. You get an invitation to a place called Harbinger's Watch, which is an ice floe that has been expanding lately, and you'd like to find out why after getting a mysterious invitation from who turns out to be Vatnir, a sidekick and recruitable character that you can take through this DLC, because at the heart of this DLC is a dragon that is escaping through a portal to the beyond known as the White Void, the realm of Rimmergand, the god of entropy and oblivion, which is why this ice floe is expanding. And it's just a really cool DLC that focuses in on some really great lore, like around St. Widewin and the old Hawana civilization. It's also got some really cool fights, and there's some unique interactions. And while this is not like canon in any sense of the word, it also provides a potential solution for what to do about the Watcher, especially in the face of like all the reincarnation stuff that happens. If there's ever a Pillars 3, I have no idea if we'll still be playing the Watcher of Cadnua, but they have sort of built themselves in a little off-ramp here via Beast of Winter, if they choose to take it, that is. But I love this DLC. It's, again, my favorite personally. I just thought it was very cool. And then there is Forbidden Sanctum. Forbidden Sanctum deals with Whale and the Titans. You see, when the gods manufactured themselves into gods, at one point they made the Titans, bodies they could walk around the world of Eora with. They eventually decided this was a bad idea and abandoned it, but the bodies can still be found. And that's kind of what's at the heart of the Forbidden Sanctum DLC. The body of Whale, the god of mystery. At the same time, you get to interact with the Hand Occult, which makes it its job to try to make things obscure and unknown, and so you can get all this lore that's like slightly wrong and of questionable use. As Whale seeks to distribute disinformation about all sorts of stuff, you get to involve yourself in the Council of Archmagi, and there's also some really cool fights and some really unique set pieces that are here as well, so Forbidden Sanctum is cool and an enjoyable experience, worth experiencing if you like the rest of the game, of course. That, however, finally brings us to the Steam Deck section before we start wrapping this up. Just in case you were curious, this game is considered playable on the Steam Deck, and that is due to the text size and the lack of controller support. I will say the lack of controller support is a little strange, as this game is available on consoles but does not have controller support via Steam for some reason. As a result, you'll need to configure the controls on the Steam Deck if you want to do that, but if you're willing to jump through those hoops, it plays fine there. Just so you are aware. But that brings me to the positives and negatives and then my conclusion. So on the positive side of things, if you couldn't tell, I just love the world of Eora. The lore of this place and like the back and forth and the situation between the gods, the mortals, the messy nuance that goes into the themes of colonization that saturate every game in the series. And while I absolutely understand that some of the presentation is a little dry and not for everybody, for me, I love this stuff. It's actually, I would go so far as to say, one of those instances in which I love the lore even more than I love the game itself, even though the game is pretty fun. The other side of it, though, is really just like the depth beyond the surface level. Like, if you choose to dig in, there's just so much interesting stuff to discover, so many little details and little things that this game gets right, and that if you go searching for them, I think they stick with you, and it's just one of those games that over time has even grown on me more and more. Thanks to all these little things you can discover and ways to play and mastery over individual systems and going back and trying like a different playthrough with this individual combination of things, that kind of stuff. I think it also just makes a ton of improvements that make it a more playable game than the original, even if I understand the people who prefer the tone and everything from the first game. There are nonetheless some negatives. Obviously, this isn't my favorite CRPG that I've talked about over the years, and that's for a variety of different reasons, one of which is the very, very short main story. A little too short, to be honest with you. 90% of the game, I would say, is really more side content than main story, but the flip side of that as well is that you get this cliffhanger ending that, unfortunately, I don't know that we're ever going to see a resolution to. It's been 8 years since this game launched, and it's not looking good, all things considered. If you've been watching the news, as far as the industry is concerned, my hopes are not high for a Pillars 3. And you have like this incredibly interesting thing that would be the obvious focus of Pillars 3, and I just don't know if we're ever going to get it, and it drives me crazy. And I don't love that. Another, honestly, kind of nitpicky negative is the pathfinding can be rough. On the world map especially, sometimes you will be traveling and then your ship will just stop, even if you set course for somewhere via the menu or even just clicking on it. The ship is just like, actually, no thanks, and it just completely stops, and then you got to go in and make it move again, and that can happen on regular maps as well. Sometimes characters just become unresponsive and don't want to go anywhere. That can certainly be very frustrating. There's that stuff with the companions I mentioned, where it really feels like they should have more involvement than they do, and they again tried to help that out a little bit with the recommended companions for quests. You get the most interactions, but even then it kind of feels like they're not chiming in as much as they should, especially when you're often bringing like the direct competition via faction representatives into enemy headquarters, and sometimes they'll comment on that, but there are other times where you're like, I really feel like you should be saying something, and they just don't. They will eventually leave if you commit to like other factions and stuff, but even then it just feels like a little off in places, which isn't helped along by the fact that your main companions really only have one quest, and only a couple of those quests are even substantial. Like Seraphine's, for instance, is super short. But ultimately, that brings me to my conclusion, which I realize might come as an astounding shock to some of you, but generally, yes, I obviously recommend this game. In fact, I think there are very few games I have beaten as thoroughly as Deadfire. It's not a perfect game by any means, but it's got just a ton of fantastic details. I think it's a huge improvement over the original in all the ways that matter to me personally. And while it certainly has its shortcomings, I by and large think it's an incredible game set in an incredibly interesting world. And I think it would be a really big shame if we didn't see any more games set in the world of Eora. But even if we don't, I still hope people wind up playing Pillars 1, Pillars 2, even Avowed, and appreciating what this world was all about, appreciating all the tiny little details that I think often go unnoticed, like the fact that all the enemies technically drop different types of currency that the game helpfully sorts out into the single currency that you actually use on the trading screens, for example, just as a way to help differentiate their various cultures that I talked about. But I suppose I will close with this. As I'm sure many people watching this are aware, Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 have never been my favorite CRPG. I've been pretty upfront about that. Gameplay-wise, I have certainly played better and more interesting games that I honestly think if we ever do see a Pillars 3, it would need to do something to try to contend with in the hopes that it actually sold well. But one thing that has forever stuck with me after playing these games, and why I made so many lore videos about it, and why I'm making this video, and why I talk about them every chance I get, is that there is something truly special about the world of Eora that I think is worth continuing and worth building on. I don't know what the future of this franchise holds. Pillars 3 seems less likely by the day, Avowed 2 seems possible, but I gotta be honest with you, I just don't know how well that would do financially. But what I do know is that the world of Eora is one of a handful of games where the setting and the world building has sort of transcended just what it is in video games to me. And so if you wind up playing this or any of the Pillars games or Avowed even, and any of that speaks to you even half as much as I've enjoyed the world, then I would certainly love to hear about it. But I do think that's where we're going to wrap up this particular video. If you enjoyed all of that rambling, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. On the off chance anything happens with the Pillars universe in the future, I will certainly be covering it. Otherwise, though, I typically just review games. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.